The warden had seen violence before, but that morning something felt different. The cafeteria was too quiet, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then he saw it. A group of inmates huddled in the corner, an old man on his knees, and above him one inmate, grinning, holding a pot of boiling water. The warden didn't shout. He just started walking. Each step echoed against the concrete walls. The bully laughed. "What's the matter, boss? You gonna stop me?" The warden stopped just a few feet away. His voice was calm. "Put it down." But when the inmate smirked and raised the pot higher, the old man whispered one word under his breath. "Please." And that's when everything changed. "Stay with me until the end." Because what the warden did next would make every inmate in that room realize who they were really locked up with. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The steam from that pot twisted upward like smoke from a dying fire. Warden Samuel Brooks had walked these halls for 23 years. He'd broken up riots, stopped stabbings, and seen men transform from beasts into broken souls begging for redemption. But this morning, watching that trembling old man named Henry crouched on the cold concrete floor, something stirred in his chest that hadn't moved in decades. Henry Martinez was 72 years old. His gray hair hung thin and wispy around his weathered face. His hands shook not from fear alone, but from the medication that kept his heart beating. He'd been sentenced to 8 years for embezzlement, a white-collar crime that had landed him in a world where survival meant staying invisible. For 6 months, he'd managed to keep his head down, eat his meals in silence, and pray that each day would pass without incident. But Marcus "Tank" Williams had other plans. Tank stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and territory. He ruled Cell Block C with an iron fist, demanding tribute from the weak and crushing anyone who dared to resist. His dark eyes gleamed with malice as he held that pot of boiling water, steam rising between his thick fingers like the breath of a dragon ready to strike. The other inmates formed a circle around them, some watching with sick fascination, others turning their faces away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the scene. The smell of institutional disinfectant mixed with something else, something that reminded Warden Brooks of fear itself. "You think you're better than us, old man?" Tank's voice boomed across the cafeteria. "With your fancy words and your college education? In here, none of that matters. In here, you're just meat." Henry's lips moved silently, perhaps in prayer, perhaps whispering the names of grandchildren he might never see again. A tear rolled down his cheek, catching the harsh light like a diamond of pure desperation. Warden Brooks had entered the cafeteria for a routine inspection. It was 7:30 in the morning, the time when inmates gathered for breakfast before work detail assignments. The room normally buzzed with conversation, the clatter of plastic trays, and the occasional argument over seating arrangements. But today, the silence felt thick enough to cut with a knife. He'd noticed the crowd first. 20 men standing in a tight circle, their backs turned toward the center. Their posture was tense, expectant, like spectators at a gladiator match waiting for blood to spill. Something primal in their stance made his instincts scream danger. As he moved closer, the circle parted slightly. That's when he saw Tank towering over Henry, that pot raised high like a weapon of torture. The old man's prison uniform was already soaked with sweat and tears. His knees pressed against the concrete floor, hands clasped in front of him in a gesture that could have been surrender or supplication. Warden Brooks had seen this before. The strong preying on the weak, the young destroying the old. But something about Henry's quiet dignity in the face of such cruelty touched a nerve deep in his soul. Perhaps it was the way the old man refused to beg loudly, maintaining his composure even as death stared him in the face. Perhaps it was the memory of his own grandfather, a gentle man who had taught him that true strength came from protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Arden's voice cut through the silence like Tank, the W blade. I said put it down. Tank's grin widened, showing teeth stained yellow from years of neglect. Come on, Warden. This old fool owes me protection money. $50 a week to keep breathing. He thinks his wrinkled skin makes him special, but I'm about to show him what happens to people who don't pay their debts. The pot trembled slightly in Tank's massive hands. Steam continued to rise from the boiling water, creating a thin mist that danced between predator and prey. Henry closed his eyes, his lips moving faster now in silent prayer. Warden Brooks studied the scene with the calculating gaze of a man who had spent decades reading the language of violence. He could see the tension in Tank's shoulders, the way his weight shifted from foot to foot like a boxer preparing to strike. He could hear the quickened breathing of the watching inmates, smell the metallic scent of adrenaline mixing with fear. But more than anything, he could see himself in Henry's place, not because he was old or weak, but because he recognized the look of a man who had made mistakes and was paying a price far greater than the crime deserved. Henry had stolen money from his company to pay for his wife's cancer treatments. The courts had shown no mercy for his desperation, and now he faced the possibility of dying in a place where mercy was a luxury few could afford. You know what your problem is, Tank? Warden Brooks stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more authority than any shout. You think fear makes you powerful. You think breaking people makes you strong. But all you've really done is show everyone in this room that you're still that scared little boy who used to get beaten by his daddy and the pot. Shh. Tank's face dark harder in his hands. You don't know nothing about me, old man. I know everything about you. Warden Brooks took another step forward. I know you were 12 when your father went to prison for armed robbery. I know your mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. I know you started dealing drugs at 14 because you thought money would make people respect you. And I know that deep down, you're still that frightened kid looking for someone weaker to hurt so you can feel strong. The cafeteria had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen workers had stopped their morning preparations to watch the confrontation unfold. Henry remained on his knees, but his eyes had opened. He stared up at the warden with something that might have been hope beginning to flicker in their depths. Tank's jaw clenched. His grip tightened on the pot handle. Shut up. You don't know what it's like in here. You go home to your nice house and your safe neighborhood every night. We live in hell. You're right. Warden Brooks nodded slowly. I do go home every night, but I also come back every morning. And I've been doing it for 23 years. You know why? Because I believe that even in hell, good men can choose to be better than their circumstances. He gestured toward Henry without taking his eyes off Tank. This man made a mistake. He stole money, and he's paying for it. But he's not your enemy. He's not the reason your life went wrong. He's just an old man trying to survive long enough to see his family again. Tank's breathing became heavier. The steam from the pot created a thin veil between his face and Henry's. He's got money on the outside. His family's loaded. He can afford to pay. And what happens when he pays you 50 this week? Next week you'll want 100. The week after that, you'll want his commissary money too. Then his medicine money. Then you'll want him to call his family and ask for more. Where does it end, Tank? When does a man like you ever have enough? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Tank's eyes darted around the circle of watching inmates, reading their faces, measuring their reactions. Some nodded slightly at the warden's words. Others remained stone-faced, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Henry's voice rose barely above a whisper. Please, I have grandchildren. They're only 6 and 8 years old. They don't understand why Grandpa can't come to their birthday parties anymore. All I want is to live long enough to explain to them that good people sometimes make bad choices, but that doesn't make them bad people. His words struck the room like a physical blow. Several inmates shifted uncomfortably. One man in the back of the circle turned away completely. Even Tank's grip on the pot seemed to loosen slightly. Warden Brooks saw the moment of hesitation and pressed forward. You have a choice to make right now, Marcus Williams. You can pour that water and become the monster everyone expects you to be. Or you can put it down and show these men that even in the darkest place, a man can choose to be something more than his worst impulses. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed shut with the finality of judgment. The steam from the pot had begun to thin, but the tension in the room remained thick as concrete. Tank stared down at Henry, then up at the warden, then around at the circle of faces watching him. His reputation hung in the balance. His authority over Cell Block C depended on this moment. But something in Henry's quiet dignity and the warden's steady gaze had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. The pot trembled in his hands as he stood at the crossroads between the man he had become and the man he might still choose to be. The seconds stretched like hours. Tank's knuckles had turned white around the pot handle, steam still curling upward between his fingers like the ghost of violence yet to come. The cafeteria held its breath, 20 pairs of eyes locked on a moment that would define not just Henry's fate, but the very soul of Cell Block C. Then something shifted in Tank's expression. The hardness in his eyes flickered, like a candle flame caught in an unexpected breeze. His gaze dropped to Henry's weathered face, to the quiet tears streaming down the old man's cheeks, to hands that shook not just with fear, but with the tremor of age and medication. "My grandmother," Tank whispered, so softly that only the warden and Henry could hear. "She used to shake like that when the cancer took her." The pot wavered in his grip. Steam escaped in thin wisps, but the deadly intent seemed to drain from his posture like water from a broken vessel. The circle of inmates sensed the change, some leaning forward with anticipation, others stepping back as if the very air had become dangerous to breathe. Warden Brooks didn't move. He understood that this moment balanced on the edge of a knife. One wrong word, one sudden gesture, and Tank might snap back into violence like a rubber band released under tension. Instead, he waited, letting the silence speak louder than any threat or promise could. Henry lifted his head slowly, meeting Tank's gaze with eyes that held no hatred, no anger, only the quiet resignation of a man who had already made peace with his mortality. "You don't have to carry this weight," he said, his voice barely audible. "Whatever they did to you, whatever broke inside you, you don't have to pass it on." Tank's breathing became ragged. The pot shook in his hands, hot water sloshing dangerously close to the rim. Around them, the watching inmates seemed frozen in time, witnesses to something none of them had expected to see in this place of concrete and steel and forgotten dreams. "You don't understand." Tank's voice cracked like ice under pressure. "In here, if you show weakness, you're dead. If you let one person disrespect you, everyone thinks they can walk all over you. I built my reputation on fear because fear is the only currency that matters in this place." Warden Brooks took one careful step closer. "And where has that gotten you, son? Are you respected or just feared? Do people follow you because they believe in you or because they're terrified of what you might do to them?" The question hung in the air like a judgment. Tank looked around the circle, really looked at the faces surrounding him. He saw fear in their eyes, yes, but also something else, something that might have been pity or disappointment, or the quiet hope that he might prove himself capable of something better than the monster he had worked so hard to become. Officer Rodriguez appeared at the cafeteria entrance, his hand resting on his radio. He had heard the commotion and come running, but now he stood frozen, reading the delicate tension in the room. One wrong move from anyone could shatter this fragile moment and turn it into the bloodbath they were all trying to avoid. The warden caught Rodriguez's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Wait. Let this play out." Sometimes the most dangerous moments required the most patience, and Samuel Brooks had learned long ago that real authority came not from the power to punish, but from the wisdom to know when not to use it. Tank closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked like the frightened boy the warden had described. His shoulders sagged under the weight of years of violence, years of building walls around his heart with the bricks of other people's pain. The pot continued to tremble in his grip, but the trembling had changed. It was no longer the shake of rage, but the quiver of a man standing at the crossroads of his own soul. "I was 8, Tank said suddenly, his eyes still closed. 8 years old when my daddy first put his hands on me, told me crying was for weak boys, and weak boys don't survive in this world. So I learned not to cry. I learned to hit back twice as hard as I got hit. I learned that power meant never letting anyone see you bleed." Henry's voice was gentle as summer rain. "But you're bleeding now, son, and that's okay. Sometimes we have to bleed before we can heal." The words seemed to break something inside Tank's chest. A sound escaped his throat, half sob, half growl. The cry of a wounded animal that had been hiding its pain for so long, it had forgotten what healing felt like. The pot began to lower, inch by agonizing inch, as if Tank were fighting against every instinct that had kept him alive in this brutal place. "They'll see this," Tank whispered, his voice breaking. "They'll see me back, down, and they'll think I'm weak. The wolves will come for me, the young ones looking to make their reputation. I'll be the old man on his knees next week." Warden Brooks stepped closer, close enough now that he could feel the steam from the pot brushing against his face. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Or maybe they'll see a man strong enough to choose mercy over violence. Maybe they'll see someone brave enough to break a cycle that's been destroying lives for generations." Around them, the circle of inmates remained silent, but their stillness had changed. Where before they had been frozen by the anticipation of violence, now they seemed held by something else, something like awe or recognition, or the faint stirring of hope in hearts that had long ago given up on the possibility of redemption. Jimmy "Scarface" Morrison stood near the back of the circle, a man whose own reputation had been built on the bones of weaker inmates. But as he watched Tank struggle with the weight of choice, something stirred in his own chest. A memory of his little sister, crying as the police took him away for the last time. A memory of promises broken and innocence destroyed in the name of survival. Next to him, Carlos Vega shifted uncomfortably, remembering his own grandmother's funeral, which he had missed because of a fight that had landed him in solitary. She had raised him after his parents died, taught him to read, made him promise to be better than the streets that had claimed so many of the boys in their neighborhood. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten those promises, traded them for the temporary power that came from making others afraid. The ripple of recognition spread through the watching men like stones thrown into still water. Each face reflected its own private reckoning, its own moment of seeing past the masks they wore to the frightened, broken boys they had once been. The cafeteria had become something more than a place of institutional feeding. It had become a cathedral of second chances, a courtroom where the jury was composed of men who understood the weight of choices made in darkness. Tank opened his eyes and looked directly at Henry. The old man's face was streaked with tears, but his gaze was steady, patient, waiting without judgment for whatever decision would come. In those weathered features, Tank saw something he had almost forgotten existed: compassion without condition, forgiveness without price, love that asked for nothing in return except the chance to heal what had been broken. "I don't know how," Tank whispered, the admission torn from his throat like a confession. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am. I've been angry for so long, I don't remember what it feels like to be anything else." Henry struggled to his knees, his movements slow and painful, but determined. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had survived his own darkness and found light on the other side. "You start small," he said. "You start with one choice, one moment of choosing something better than the worst thing you could do. And then tomorrow, you make that choice again. And the day after that, until one day, you look in the mirror and see a man you can respect." The pot was almost at Tank's side now, the water cooling, the steam thinning to wisps. The immediate danger was passing, But everyone in that room understood that something far more significant was happening. This wasn't just about preventing violence. This was about the possibility of transformation, the chance for a man to step back from the edge of his own destruction and choose a different path. Warden Brooks felt his heart hammering against his ribs. In 23 years of corrections work, he had seen plenty of violence prevented, plenty of situations diffused through authority and intimidation. But this was different. This was a man choosing to lay down his weapons not because he was forced to, but because he had remembered something better inside himself. The cafeteria clock ticked toward 8 o'clock. Soon, work details would begin, and this moment would pass into memory. But the choice being made here would ripple through cell block C for months to come, changing the very nature of what it meant to be strong in a place designed to break the human spirit. Tank looked around the circle one more time, meeting the eyes of men who had followed him, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. In their faces, he saw his own reflection multiplied, distorted by the harsh fluorescent light into a gallery of lost souls waiting to see if redemption was possible. Even here, even now, even for someone like him. The pot touched the floor with the softest whisper of metal against concrete, and with that sound, something fundamental shifted in the air itself. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Tank's massive frame seemed to deflate as the pot settled against the cold concrete, steam rising one final time before dissipating into nothing. The circle of watching inmates remained frozen, their faces etched with disbelief. In a place where violence was currency and mercy was weakness, they had just witnessed something that challenged everything they understood about survival. Henry slowly pushed himself up from his knees, his weathered hands trembling as they pressed against the floor. The old man's dignity remained intact, despite the tears that had carved silver tracks down his cheeks. He looked at Tank not with triumph or relief, but with something deeper, understanding, perhaps, the recognition of one broken soul seeing another. Warden Brooks felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, but he kept his stance ready. 23 years in corrections had taught him that dangerous moments could reignite without warning. The cafeteria remained unnaturally quiet, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Tank pot beside his feet, his massive, stared down at the hands, now empty and shaking. The tattoos that covered his arms seemed to writhe in the fluorescent light, each one telling a story of violence, territory, and the desperate need to belong somewhere, even if that somewhere was built on fear. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "What happens now?" Tank asked, and in those 3 words was the vulnerability of a man who had just stepped off the edge of everything he knew. What happens when word gets out that Tank Williams backed down, that he showed mercy to some old man who couldn't fight back? Before Warden Brooks could answer, Jimmy Scarface stepped forward from the circle. His scarred face bore the evidence of countless fights, but his eyes held something unexpected. Respect, perhaps, or the beginning of it. "Maybe," Jimmy said slowly, his voice carrying across the silent cafeteria. "Word gets out that Tank Williams was man enough to choose something harder than violence. Maybe word gets out that he's stronger than we thought." A murmur rippled through the circle. Carlos Vega nodded slowly, then stepped forward himself. "My grandmother used to say that any fool can break something. It takes a real man to choose not to." One by one, other voices joined in. Not all of them, but enough to matter. Enough to create a crack in the wall of fear that had governed Cell Block C for so long. The men who spoke weren't Tank's followers anymore. They were men remembering who they used to be before prison had carved away everything soft and hopeful inside them. But not everyone was ready for this moment of transformation. From the back of the crowd, a voice cut through the growing murmur like a blade through silk. "This is pathetic." The words came from Dante Razor Rodriguez, a young inmate barely 25 but already carrying the dead eyes of a killer. He pushed through the circle, his movements predatory and fluid. "You're all standing here acting like this old fool matters. Like any of this matters. Tank, you just showed every man in this place that you've gone soft. That means your territory is up for grabs. The cafeteria tension spiked again. Different now, but no less dangerous. Where Tank's violence had been hot and personal, Razor's threat felt cold, calculated. He was young enough to still believe that reputation was everything, old enough to have the skills to take what he wanted. Warden Brooks studied Razor's approach, reading the subtle signs of a man preparing for violence, the slight forward lean, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, the predatory focus in his gaze. This was a different kind of dangerous than Tank had been. Tank's rage came from pain and broken dreams. Razor's violence came from ambition and the hunger for power. Razor, the warden's voice carried the authority of decades, but he knew it might not be enough. Young predators like Dante Rodriguez didn't respect authority the way older inmates did. They saw it as just another obstacle to overcome. This doesn't concern you. Razor's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Doesn't concern me. Tank here just gave up his crown in front of everybody. In here, power doesn't stay vacant. Nature abhors a vacuum. Isn't that what they say? Well, I'm nature. He stopped directly in front of Tank, close enough that the size difference became apparent. Tank still towered over the younger man, but something fundamental had shifted. The aura of unstoppable violence that had surrounded Tank like armor was gone, replaced by uncertainty and the vulnerability that came with choosing mercy. So what's it gonna be, old man? Razor's voice was soft, intimate, the tone of a snake before it strikes. You gonna let me take everything you built? Your territory, your respect, your protection racket? Or are you gonna fight for it? Henry stepped between them before Tank could respond. The old man's movement was slow but deliberate, his frail body creating a barrier between the two younger, stronger men. The gesture was both brave and foolish, the act of someone who understood that sometimes standing up meant accepting the consequences, no matter how terrible they might be. Son, Henry said, looking up at Razor with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. This doesn't have to be your story. You can choose something different. Razor's response was swift and brutal. His hand shot out, connecting with Henry's chest in a shove that sent the old man stumbling backward. Henry's legs, already unsteady from age and the strain of kneeling, gave way beneath him. He crashed to the floor, his head striking the concrete with a sound that echoed through the cafeteria like a gunshot. The silence that followed was different from before. Where the earlier quiet had been tense with possibility, this silence hummed with barely contained rage. Tank's transformation had been gradual, a melting of ice under gentle warmth, but watching Henry fall, seeing blood begin to pool beneath the old man's silver hair, something snapped back into place inside Tank's chest with the force of a breaking dam. You just made a mistake, Tank said, his voice dropping to a register that made several inmates step backward. The gentleness that had touched his features moments before was gone, replaced by something colder and more terrible than simple anger. This wasn't rage born of ego or territory. This was the fury of a man who had found something worth protecting and watched it be destroyed. Razor grinned, mistaking Tank's controlled tone for weakness. What are you going to do about it, Grandpa? Call for the warden? Cry about it? You already showed everyone what you really are. But Warden Brooks was already moving, kneeling beside Henry, checking for a pulse, calling for the medical team. Blood seeped between his fingers as he applied pressure to the wound on the old man's head. Henry's eyes fluttered, conscious but dazed, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or simply the whispered names of grandchildren he might never see again. Get the medical team down here now! Brooks barked into his radio, his voice tight with controlled fury. We have a head injury in the cafeteria. Possible concussion. Around them, the circle of inmates began to shift and change. The men who had moments before been witnessing Tank's transformation now found themselves caught between two different kinds of violence. Tank's original threat to Henry had been about power and intimidation, business as usual in the brutal economy of prison life. But Razor's attack on the old man felt different. Personal. Unnecessary. The kind of cruelty that served no purpose except to prove that he could inflict pain without consequence. Jimmy Scarface looked down at Henry's bleeding form and felt something twist in his chest. His own grandmother had died while he was locked up, and he'd never gotten the chance to say goodbye. Never gotten to tell her that the lessons she'd taught him about kindness and dignity hadn't been completely forgotten, just buried under years of survival and compromise. Carlos Vega saw his own reflection in Henry's pain, remembering his grandfather's funeral, which he'd missed because of a fight that had landed him in solitary. The old man had taught him to read, made him promise to use his mind instead of his fists, to build instead of destroy. But somewhere along the way, those promises had gotten lost in the noise of staying alive. One by one, the watching inmates began to make a choice. Not the choice between Tank and Razor, but the choice between the men they had become and the men they remembered being before prison, had stripped away everything soft and hopeful inside them. Tank knelt beside Henry, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he helped support the old man's head. "You're gonna be okay," he whispered, and for the first time in years, his voice carried something besides threat or intimidation. It carried care. Razor watched this display with disgust. "Look at you, the mighty Tank Williams, playing nursemaid to some old fool who probably stole money from widows and orphans. You think this makes you noble? You think this makes you better than the rest of us?" But when Razor looked around the circle, expecting to see agreement, he found something else instead. The faces looking back at him weren't impressed by his display of power. They weren't afraid exactly, but they weren't admiring either. They looked at him the way people look at something distasteful. Necessary, perhaps, but not worthy of respect. "You know what your problem is, Razor?" Tank stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You think being the meanest dog in the yard makes you the strongest, but all it really makes you is the loneliest." The medical team burst through the cafeteria doors, their equipment clattering as they rushed toward Henry. The old man was conscious now, trying to sit up despite the blood matting his silver hair. A paramedic knelt beside him, checking his pupils with a small flashlight, asking questions in a calm, professional voice. Officer Rodriguez moved to separate Tank and Razor, but Warden Brooks held up a hand, stopping him. Sometimes, the warden had learned, the most important lessons couldn't be taught through official channels. Sometimes, justice had to be allowed to find its own shape, even in the controlled environment of a correctional facility. "You want to know what real strength looks like?" Tank asked, his voice carrying across the silent cafeteria. "It's not about who can hurt the most people. It's not about who everyone's afraid of. Real strength is knowing you could destroy someone and choosing not to. Real strength is protecting something weaker than yourself instead of crushing it." Razor's hand moved toward his waistband, where a sharpened piece of plastic was hidden beneath his prison uniform. But before he could draw it, three things happened simultaneously. Jimmy Scarface stepped up beside Tank, his scarred face set in determination. Carlos Vega moved to Tank's other side, his own reputation for violence now serving a different purpose. And from the back of the circle, more voices began to speak. "Tank's right. The kid's out of line. Someone needs to teach Razor some respect. That old man didn't deserve that." The balance of power in Cell Block C was shifting, not through violence or intimidation, but through something more fundamental. The recognition that even in the darkest place, even among men who had committed terrible crimes, there was still a line between necessary survival and unnecessary cruelty. And Razor had just crossed it. Warden Brooks watched this transformation with amazement and growing concern. He had seen prison hierarchies change before, but usually through bloodshed and chaos. This was different. This was men choosing to stand for something better than their worst impulses, even when that choice came with risk. But he also knew that Razor wouldn't go quietly. Young predators like him didn't surrender territory without a fight. and the weapon hidden beneath his uniform made this situation exponentially more dangerous. One wrong move, one moment of lost control, and this moment of moral awakening could turn into a bloodbath that would haunt everyone involved. The paramedic looked up from his examination of Henry. He's going to need stitches, but the concussion appears to be minor. We should transport him to the medical wing for a full evaluation. Henry tried to wave them off, his voice weak but determined. I'm fine. Just help me up. But Tank was there first, his massive arms supporting the old man with surprising gentleness. No, he said firmly. You're going to let them take care of you. And when you're feeling better, we're going to have a talk about protection money and how things are going to change around here. Razor's face twisted with rage and disbelief. The weapon in his waistband felt heavy against his hip, calling to him like a solution to all his problems. One quick strike, and this whole embarrassing situation would be over. Tank would be bleeding on the floor, his reputation restored through violence, his authority unquestioned. But as his hand moved toward the hidden blade, Razor found himself looking into the faces of 20 men who were no longer afraid of him. They weren't necessarily willing to die for Tank or Henry, but they were willing to stand up for something that mattered more than territory or reputation. They were willing to stand up for the idea that even here, even in this place of concrete and steel and forgotten dreams, there was still such a thing as going too far. The cafeteria held its breath once more, balanced on the edge of a knife, waiting to see whether this moment of transformation would survive its first real test, or whether it would die in blood and chaos like so many other hopes had died in this place where mercy was a luxury few could afford. In the silence, Henry's voice rose barely above a whisper, but somehow it carried to every corner of the room. Please, he said again, just as he had when Tank held the boiling water above his head. But this time, the word wasn't just a plea for his own life. It was a prayer for all of them, a hope that even in the darkest place, even among men who had lost everything, there was still a choice to be made between the monster they could become and the men they still remembered being. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces etched with violence and regret, and the faint, fragile beginning of something that might have been hope. The cafeteria clock ticked toward 8:15, and everyone present understood that whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of Cell Block C, but the very possibility of redemption in a place designed to crush the human spirit. Razor's hand closed around the hidden weapon, his knuckles white with the force of his grip, while around him, 20 pairs of eyes waited to see if mercy could survive in a world built on brutality, or if it would die as quickly as it had been born. The weapon felt cold against Razor's palm, its sharpened edge promising swift resolution to this humiliation. But as he began to draw it from his waistband, something unexpected happened. Henry's weathered hand reached up from where he sat on the concrete floor, not toward Razor's weapon, but toward Tank's massive arm. "Don't let him take this from you," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible above the buzzing fluorescent lights. "Don't let him make you into what you just chose not to be." Tank's eyes never left Razor's face, but Henry's words struck him like a physical blow. The old man was right. This moment, this choice between mercy and violence, hung in the balance not because of Razor's threats, but because of what Tank would do next. He could feel the familiar fire building in his chest, the rage that had sustained him through years of brutality, calling him back to the only language this place seemed to understand. But something had changed in those few minutes when he'd knelt beside Henry's bleeding form. Something had cracked open inside his chest, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. The faces surrounding him weren't looking at him with fear anymore. They were looking at him with something he'd never experienced in this place: hope. Jimmy Scarface stepped closer, his voice low but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "You know what I see when I look at you right now, Tank? I see my brother, not my blood brother, but the man who chose to stand between a predator and his prey. That's worth more than any reputation built on fear. Carlos Vega nodded, his own scarred hands clenched at his sides. My grandfather used to tell me that a man's true measure isn't in how many people he can hurt, but in how many he chooses to protect. I forgot that for a long time, but watching you just now, I remembered. Razor's face contorted with desperate fury. The support tank was gaining wasn't supposed to happen. Prison hierarchies didn't work this way. Power came from violence, respect came from fear, and weakness was supposed to be punished, not rewarded. His grip tightened on the concealed blade as he realized his window of opportunity was closing. "You're all pathetic," Razor snarled, his voice cracking with the strain of maintaining control. "Standing here like this old fool's some kind of saint. He's a criminal just like the rest of us. He stole money, destroyed lives, broke families, and you're treating him like he deserves protection." Warden Brooks had been watching this exchange with the careful attention of a man who understood that the next few seconds would determine whether this situation ended in transformation or tragedy. He could see Razor's hand moving toward his concealed weapon, could read the desperation in the young man's posture. But he also saw something else in the faces of the surrounding inmates, a unity he'd never witnessed in 23 years of corrections work. "You're right about one thing, Razor," Henry said, his voice growing stronger despite the blood that continued to seep from his head wound. "I am a criminal. I stole $300,000 from the company where I worked for 30 years. I betrayed the trust of people who considered me family. I destroyed my own reputation and brought shame on my children and grandchildren." The cafeteria fell silent as Henry struggled to his feet, Tank's supportive hand steadying him. The old man's confession hung in the air like a weight, but instead of weakening his position, it seemed to strengthen it. There was power in owning your failures, dignity in refusing to hide from the truth of who you'd become. "But I didn't steal that money for greed or pleasure," Henry continued, his eyes meeting, Razor's with quiet strength. "I stole it because my wife was dying of cancer, and our insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatments that might have saved her life. I stole it because I was desperate and afraid and willing to sacrifice everything for the woman I'd loved for 47 years. His voice broke slightly, but he pressed on. It didn't work. She died anyway, 3 months before my trial began. So I lost everything. My freedom, my family's respect, my own sense of who I was. But I learned something in that loss that you haven't learned yet, son. I learned that the worst thing you can do to another person isn't hurting their body. It's killing their hope." Razor's hand froze on his weapon. Something in Henry's words had struck a nerve he'd thought was dead, touched a memory he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. His own mother, working 3 jobs to keep food on their table after his father abandoned them. The night she collapsed from exhaustion in their tiny apartment kitchen, and 8-year-old Dante had tried to wake her up, terrified she was gone forever. "That's different," Razor whispered, but the conviction had drained from his voice. "That's not the same thing, isn't it?" Henry took a careful step forward, his movements slow but determined. "We're all here because we made choices in moments of desperation or anger or fear. The only difference is what we choose to do with that knowledge. Do we let it make us bitter and cruel, or do we let it teach us compassion for others who are struggling with their own demons?" The medical team had finished their initial assessment and were preparing to transport Henry to the infirmary. But the old man waved them off with a gentle gesture, his attention focused entirely on the young man whose hand still gripped a weapon that could end this moment of grace before it had a chance to grow. Tank watched this exchange with growing amazement. He'd spent years using his size and reputation to control through fear, but Henry was accomplishing something far more powerful through simple honesty and compassion. The old man was disarming Razor not with threats or violence, but with the radical act of seeing him as a human being worth saving. "I know about your mother," Henry said softly, and Razor's entire body went rigid. "I know she died while you were in county lockup waiting for trial. I know you blamed yourself because you weren't there to help her. because your choices put you behind bars when she needed you most. Tears began to form in Razor's eyes, though his face remained hard as stone. Shut up. You don't know anything about me. I know because I see it in your eyes every time someone mentions family. I know because I carry the same guilt about my wife, the same regret about choices that can't be undone. The difference is, I've learned to carry that weight without passing it on to others. You're still trying to make the world pay for your pain. The circle of watching inmates had grown completely still. Men who had spent years building walls around their hearts found themselves witnessing something they'd never expected to see in this place. Genuine compassion, offered without condition or expectation of return. The kind of grace that most of them had forgotten existed. Officer Rodriguez stood near the cafeteria entrance, his hand still resting on his radio. He'd seen plenty of prison confrontations diffused through force or negotiation. But this was something entirely different. This was healing happening in real time. The slow dissolution of years of accumulated rage and pain. Warden Brooks felt his own throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. In 2 decades of corrections work, he'd seen men transform themselves through education, through religion, through the simple passage of time. But he'd never seen anything like this rapid, fundamental shift in the moral atmosphere of an entire cell block. Razor's grip on the concealed weapon began to loosen. The tears in his eyes had started to fall, carving clean tracks down his cheeks. His voice, when it came, was the broken whisper of a child who'd been pretending to be a monster for so long. He'd almost convinced himself it was true. I dream about her every night, Razor said, the admission torn from his throat like a confession. I dream about the phone call telling me she was gone, about the funeral I couldn't attend because I was locked up for armed robbery, about all the times she told me I was better than the streets, and I laughed at her because I thought she didn't understand how the world really worked. Henry nodded with the understanding of someone who had walked through his own valley of regret and emerged on the other side. She was right, you know. You are better than this, better than what you've become, better than what this place has tried to make you. But you have to choose to believe that, and you have to choose it every single day. The weapon slipped from Razor's fingers, clattering to the concrete floor with the sound of surrender. He sank to his knees, his body shaking with sobs that came from a place deeper than anger or fear. They came from the part of his soul that remembered being loved unconditionally, before the world had taught him that love was weakness and trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Tank looked around the circle of faces, seeing his own transformation reflected in their eyes. These men, these criminals and outcasts and forgotten souls, had just witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength and survival. They had seen mercy triumph over violence, compassion overcome cruelty, and hope take root in the most unlikely soil imaginable. This is what we're going to do, Tank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. Cell Block C is going to change. No more protection money. No more preying on the weak. No more passing our pain onto others who are just trying to survive. Jimmy Scarface stepped forward, his scarred face serious but determined. What about the young ones coming up? The ones who think violence is the only way to earn respect? Tank looked down at Razor, still kneeling on the cold concrete, still weeping for a mother he'd never see again and choices he could never undo. We teach them different. We show them that real strength comes from protecting people, not destroying them. We show them that being a man means knowing when not to fight. The medical team had waited patiently during this exchange, understanding instinctively that something important was happening. Now they approached again, their movements careful and respectful. Henry allowed them to help him toward the exit, but he paused beside Razor's kneeling form. "Your mother's watching," Henry said softly, his hand resting gently on the young man's shoulder. "She's watching to see what you do next. Make her proud." As Henry was escorted toward the medical wing, the circle of inmates began to disperse. But they moved differently now. Their postures subtly changed. The predatory alertness that had defined their interactions was replaced by something else. Not softness exactly, but a recognition that survival didn't have to mean brutality, that strength could be measured in protection rather than destruction. Warden Brooks approached Tank, his expression thoughtful. "You know this won't be easy," he said quietly. "Changing a culture that's been built on violence and fear. There will be others like Razor, others who see any show of mercy as weakness to exploit." Tank nodded, understanding the challenge ahead. Maybe. But today, 20 men saw something different. They saw that it's possible to choose compassion over cruelty, even in a place like this. That's a start. As the cafeteria emptied, Razor remained on his knees, staring at the weapon he'd dropped. Officer Rodriguez approached carefully, kicking the makeshift blade away before kneeling beside the young man. "Come on, son," Rodriguez said gently. "Let's get you cleaned up. And maybe we can talk about some programs that might help you work through some of this pain you're carrying." For the first time in years, Razor didn't resist authority. He allowed himself to be helped to his feet, supported by hands that offered assistance rather than restraint. As they walked toward the exit, he turned back once to look at the spot where Henry had knelt, where Tank had made the choice that changed everything. The cafeteria fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the tense quiet of impending violence, but the peaceful stillness that follows a storm. The fluorescent lights continued to buzz overhead, casting their harsh shadows across the empty space. But something fundamental had shifted in the air itself, as if the very atoms had been rearranged by what they'd witnessed. That afternoon, word of what had happened in the cafeteria spread through Cell Block C like wildfire. But unlike most prison news, which traveled as gossip or threat or warning, this story carried something else. It carried possibility. It carried the radical idea that even here, even in this place of concrete and steel and abandoned dreams, transformation was possible. In the medical wing, Henry sat on an examination table while a doctor stitched the wound on his scalp. Through the small window, he could see the exercise yard where inmates walked in their endless circles. But today, something was different. The usual segregation of groups based on race or gang affiliation seemed less rigid. Conversations were happening across traditional boundaries. Men were talking instead of posturing, sharing stories instead of threats. 15 stitches, the doctor announced, finishing his work. "You'll have a scar, but nothing that won't heal properly. You're lucky that young man didn't hit you harder." Henry touched the bandage gently, thinking about Razor's tears, about the broken boy he'd seen beneath the hardened criminal exterior. "I don't think luck had anything to do with it," he said softly. "Sometimes people just need permission to remember who they used to be before the world convinced them they had to be something else." The doctor looked at him curiously, but said nothing. He'd worked in correctional medicine for 8 years, and he'd learned that some conversations were beyond his professional understanding. Some healing happened in ways that couldn't be measured or quantified, couldn't be captured in medical charts or incident reports. As evening approached, Cell Block C prepared for lockdown with an atmosphere unlike anything the guards had experienced. The usual tension, the constant undercurrent of potential violence, had been replaced by something quieter but no less powerful. Men were talking to each other instead of at each other. Stories were being shared instead of threats exchanged. In his cell, Tank sat on his narrow bunk, staring at his hands. These same hands that had held the pot of boiling water, that had been ready to pour scalding punishment on an old man's head, had chosen something different, had chosen mercy. The decision still felt strange, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. But there was something right about it, too. Something that made him sleep better than he had in years. 3 cells down, Razor lay on his own bunk, staring at the ceiling. The tears had stopped, but the weight in his chest remained. It was different now, though. Not the crushing weight of anger and resentment, but the lighter burden of possibility. For the first time since his mother's death, he could imagine a future that didn't end in violence or despair. In the medical wing, Henry pulled a thin blanket up to his chin and closed his eyes. The stitches in his scalp throbbed with each heartbeat, but the pain was manageable. More importantly, the fear that had gripped him in the cafeteria was gone. In its place was something he hadn't felt in months. Hope, not just for himself, but for all of them. For Tank and Razor and Jimmy and Carlos and all the broken men who had chosen, in one crucial moment, to remember their humanity. Warden Brooks made his final rounds of the evening, walking the corridors with the measured pace of someone who had done this thousands of times. But tonight felt different. The usual sounds of cell block C, the angry voices and slamming doors, and constant undercurrent of barely contained violence had been replaced by something unprecedented. Quiet conversation, genuine laughter, the sound of men talking about their families, their regrets, their hopes for redemption. As he completed his circuit and prepared to leave for the night, Brooks paused outside the medical wing. Through the small window, he could see Henry sleeping peacefully, his silver hair catching the dim light from the hallway. The old man's face, even in sleep, carried a dignity that prison hadn't been able to strip away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be other young predators like Razor, other situations where the choice between mercy and violence would have to be made again. The culture of cell block C wouldn't change overnight, and there would be setbacks, failures, moments when the old ways seemed easier than this fragile new path they'd chosen. But tonight, for the first time in 23 years of corrections work, Warden Samuel Brooks went home believing that redemption was possible, not just for individuals, but for entire communities, not just through programs or policies or official interventions, but through the simple, radical act of one human being choosing to see another as worthy of compassion. The prison settled into its nighttime rhythm, but the dreams that filled cell block C were different than they had been in years. Instead of nightmares of violence and revenge, men dreamed of mothers who had loved them, of children who still waited for their return, of second chances and new beginnings. They dreamed of becoming the men they had once been, before the world had convinced them they had to be something else. And in the morning, when the sun rose over the concrete walls and steel bars, they would wake up and choose again. Choose mercy over violence. Choose protection over predation. Choose to honor the memory of Henry Martinez's quiet dignity and Tank Williams's moment of grace, when two broken men had shown an entire cell block what it meant to be truly strong. The transformation of cell block C had begun with the sound of a pot touching concrete, with the whisper of steam dissipating into nothing, with the choice to put down a weapon and pick up hope instead. It would continue one choice at a time, one moment at a time, one act of unexpected compassion at a time, until the very walls themselves seemed to remember what it felt like to house human beings instead of animals, souls, instead of statistics, men who had fallen but were learning, slowly and carefully, how to stand back up. The ripple effects of that morning would spread far beyond cell block C. 3 weeks later, the story had reached every corner of the correctional facility. Guards whispered about it during shift changes. New inmates heard about it before they'd even been assigned their cells. The legend of Tank Williams and Henry Martinez had become something more than prison folklore. It had become a beacon. But legends have a way of attracting both followers and challengers. Marcus Steele Thompson arrived on a Tuesday morning transfer from maximum security upstate. His reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. 26 years old, built like a freight train, with dead eyes that had seen too much violence to ever find peace. He'd killed 3 men in 2 different facilities, each time claiming self-defense, each time walking away without additional charges because witnesses had a way of forgetting what they'd seen when Steele was involved. The intake officer who processed his paperwork noted the tattoos covering Steele's neck and hands. Prison ink telling stories of gangs, territories, and a philosophy that boiled down to one simple principle: Kill or be killed. There were no shades of gray in Steele's world. No room for mercy or second chances. Thompson Marcus, the officer read from his file. You're being assigned to cell block C. Warden Brooks wants to see you personally before you're integrated into general population. Steele's laugh was cold as winter rain. The famous Warden Brooks. I heard about his little social experiment. Heard he's got some old fool playing peacemaker and some washed-up tough guy pretending to be Gandhi. Can't wait to meet them. The escort to Warden Brooks' office took Steele through the heart of the facility. He studied everything with the calculating gaze of a predator mapping new territory. The guard stations, the sight lines, the places where violence could happen without immediate intervention. But something felt different about this place. The usual prison tension was there, but muted somehow, like a radio playing at half volume. In the exercise yard, he saw something that made him stop walking despite the guards' impatience. Inmates were playing basketball, but the teams weren't segregated by race or gang affiliation the way they should have been. Black inmates were passing to white players. Hispanic men were calling plays alongside Native Americans. It was wrong, unnatural, a violation of every prison rule he'd learned in 8 years of incarceration. "Keep moving, Thompson," the guard said, but Steele could hear uncertainty in the man's voice. Even the guards weren't sure what to make of this new dynamic. Warden Brooks' office was exactly what Steele had expected. Diplomas on the walls, family photos on the desk, the sterile professionalism of someone who went home to suburban safety every night while leaving. The real monsters locked behind bars. But when Brooks looked up from his paperwork, Steele saw something unexpected in the older man's eyes. Not fear, not the careful distance most administrators maintained, but genuine interest. "Marcus Thompson," Brooks said, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit down. I've been looking forward to this conversation." Steele remained standing, his posture deliberately intimidating. "I don't know what kind of operation you're running here, but I'm not interested in your rehabilitation programs or group therapy sessions. I do my time, you stay out of my way, everybody goes home happy." Brooks smiled, but there was something sharp beneath the expression. "I understand you've had some difficulties in previous facilities. 3 deaths, multiple assaults, solitary confinement totaling over 18 months. That's a lot of anger to carry around." "That's survival," Steele corrected. "Something your soft inmates here apparently never learned. But don't worry, I'll be happy to educate them." The office fell silent except for the ticking of an antique clock on Brooks's bookshelf. The warden studied Steele with the patience of someone who had seen every kind of predator the system could produce. Finally, he stood and walked to the window overlooking the exercise yard. "Tell me something, Marcus. What do you see when you look out there?" Steele joined him at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "I see weakness. I see men who've forgotten what this place really is. I see targets." "Interesting." Brooks nodded thoughtfully. "Because I see something entirely different. I see men who've remembered what it means to be human. Men who've chosen strength over brutality, protection over predation. Men who've learned that true power comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down." Steele's laugh was harsh as grinding metal. "Pretty words, Warden. But this isn't Sunday school. This is prison. And in prison, there's only one rule that matters. The strong survive and the weak serve. Is that what you believe? Or is that just what you tell yourself to justify the choices you've made? Sometimes the strongest walls aren't made of concrete and steel, but of choices. In that cafeteria where boiling water almost claimed an innocent life, 20 men discovered that mercy isn't weakness. It's the rarest form of courage. Tank Williams learned that true power comes from knowing when not to use it. Henry Martinez proved that dignity can survive even in the darkest places. And Warden Brooks showed that real authority comes from understanding the human heart, not just controlling it. The transformation of Cell Block C reminds us that no matter how far we fall, no matter how lost we become, there's always a choice to be made between the monster we could become and the man we still remember being. What would you have done in that moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories of redemption and the power of second chances.